Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Hi, welcome. So glad that everybody's here. My name is Antonio Ramirez. I'm a professor of history at Elgin Community College, and the title of my presentation tonight is Se Puede, How Latinos Remade Elgin and the Region. So we have about an hour or so. I really would, particularly because we have a small group, I'm happy to answer any questions, from the audience, either about my presentation or other questions folks might have. I hope I would be able to answer some of them. But I think I'll share a little bit of what I know for about 40 minutes or so, maybe 35 minutes. We'll see. Then we can have a conversation. I'm happy to do that. I'm a teacher, so I love to hear what folks are thinking about what's going on in your mind as you're listening to some of these things. So I want to talk by starting to say a little bit about myself. There's a picture of my family in the middle. That's my wife, Kate. She works at the health department here in King County. My two little boys. We have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. She didn't know that I was going to show that picture. So on the left-hand side here is a picture. You probably can't see this, but Kate and I lived in Mexico for a couple years, and this is the Asamblea de Migrantes Indígenas de la Ciudad de México, so the Assembly of Indigenous Migrants in the City of Mexico. So we both worked at a transnational legal rights center in Mexico. We traveled all across the country. We worked in Mexico City with indigenous migrants from around the country to the city of Mexico. But then in states across the country, we investigated labor issues for workers that had worked in the United States and suffered some type of a labor abuse, which is common, right? And it's common throughout history, for more than a century of history, as we'll see today, and had come back to Mexico. So we would talk to people and investigate their claims, and in many cases, the lawyers in the organization would file lawsuits on their behalf. And then on the right-hand side, there's pictures of some of my family. When we moved to Mexico, a lot of them, we kind of passed along the way. We lived in Zacatecas and we lived in Mexico City, and a lot of them were coming to Chicago, right? As Mexican people have been doing for more than a century, right? So a lot of them are like, why are you going to Mexico? We're all coming to Chicago. People were a little bit confused by that, but I like to show all these pictures because we have a life that is very similar to a lot of Latino people, right, that exists in more than one country, right? We often call that transnational. That our lives and our families and the people we love and the people that we care about, our ancestors, right, cross national borders. So our lives are bigger than the borders that define us, right? And I think a lot of the stories that you're going to hear today really show that that's what Latino people bring. That's one of the many things that we bring to communities like Elgin and to greater Chicago and the United States in general. So to start, I want to share one story, and this is the story of a person who, like many Mexican people, has had a transnational life. Her name's Alma Nevarez, and I'll just tell you a little bit about her story. She was born and raised in Durango, Mexico. She is the oldest of 7 children. When I asked Alma about her childhood, she said, "We were poor, but we were happy in Durango." She loved to play traditional Mexican games like the valero, like the trompo. She remembered these things really fondly when we were talking. She liked to climb trees. She liked to jump rope. Anything active, Alma loved. She always played. She was the one that was always playing with the boys. She was that kind of girl. She didn't like dolls, right? She liked to do very active things. Alma finished high school in 1981, and she actually got a good job at the municipal president's office in her town. And she worked there for 2 years. So this was, she was very good at school. She got a prestigious job. One of her responsibilities was to process the paperwork for young men who were registering for military service. And each application included a little picture that was paper clipped onto it. And Alma, as she looked at the pictures of all these young men, most of them about her age, she saw one that she thought he was kind of good looking, right? She thought he was pretty handsome, actually. And so every day when she'd get to work, she had her file, and she would kind of pull out that picture and take a look and just put it back before starting her work day. And weeks later, she was at a party in another town, and she saw the man from the picture. Okay? She knew him well, but he didn't know that she knew him, right? And at one point during the party, he came up without knowing that she had been admiring him for a while, and he asked her to dance. And they hit it off right away. There was chemistry immediately. And they ended up dancing and talking all night until the party ended at 7 a.m., and they became boyfriend and girlfriend. Alma liked her job, but as the oldest of 7 children, she needed to earn more. In the early 1980s, her pay was equivalent of about $25 every 2 weeks at the municipal president's office. And she, like many folks in Durango and other states that had sent a lot of Mexican people to the United States, had friends in the U.S. And one of her friends was in Chicago. And her friend said, Alma, we make $4.50 an hour in Chicago. You can come here, right? You can earn as much in a day in Chicago as you do in 2 weeks at home. You can help your mom. You can help the rest of your family. So Alma left for the United States in 1983. The boyfriend she met that night, he followed her. They both ended up in the Chicago area. She worked at a factory that made brushes in Franklin Park. He moved to Elgin, where he already had family. As folks know here, I'm sure that there were lots of people from Durango already in the early 1980s in Elgin. He worked in construction. He worked in drywall. They continued dating until 1987, when this couple that had met back in Mexico got married up here in the United States. So Alma's lived in the Chicago area and in this region for nearly 40 years, right? But like many Mexican people, right, including people of Mexican descent like myself, she has a transnational life. She maintains close ties with her home country, and her life traverses national borders. Every single morning, she says she wakes up and she reads dozens of WhatsApp messages from her high school classmates. They send her little memes and pictures and say, good morning, I hope you have a good day. They send jokes, they send inspirational photos to one another. And a few years, she even went back to Durango for her 38th high school reunion. The reason I know Alma is she is a custodian at Elgin Community College now, where I teach. We've gotten to know each other, and she agreed to be interviewed for this project. She started working at ECC in 2007, and she's been part of our campus community for 15 years. In her interview with me, she made it clear she thought custodial work and work like custodial work on the campus and around the community, it's important. It's important work. It's even, as the term that we learned during the COVID pandemic, it's essential work, right? Every person on campus, faculty members, administrators, we need clean offices, hallways, bathrooms. The students need clean classrooms to learn. And Alma takes pride in her work, and she's told her kids explicitly they should treat people cleaning up after them with respect, always with respect. So I'd like to share this story, starting by somebody who, lives in our community and migrated in the 1980s, because we don't often, even though we know stories like this, right? Everybody in this room, I think, knows people who made this journey. We don't often think of this as history, right? We think of history as, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the Civil War. Our histories don't often include Latino people, right? But Alma was just one of so many people that made the same journey, right? She made a journey to a new, strange country to help her family, right? To live a different kind of life. She learned the language. She struggled, right? And she contributes every day to our community. So I'd like to start with these stories because she is just one of many people who changed this community, and I think changed it for the better. Right? And I wanted to share with you, part of the reason that I know and have talked to Alma is that we have started a project at ECC that we call the Chicagolandia Project. So this is a project that focuses on stories like Alma's, of Latino people, so Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans, South Americans, who now live in the communities outside of Chicago. So places like Elgin and Waukegan and Aurora, places that many people around the country don't know have such large Latino communities. So we have a new website, you can see a picture of it here, and Alma, some clips from her interviews there, and I'm going to show you a clip from another interview a little bit later. But really what I want to share with you today are a few big ideas. Okay? Is that Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and other Latino people are not newcomers to Chicago. Though many of us arrived in the 1980s and 1990s, there is a much longer history of Latino presence, as many of us know in this room. We are not all necessarily new arrivals, though many have stereotyped the community that way. Latino Elgin was created by the individual actions of people like Alma, right? People taking a decision, a risk to migrate to a new place, right? But it was also created by larger forces. Okay? There's a reason that folks came from states like Durango and Zacatecas, right, Coahuila, to Elgin and to Aurora, and Puerto Ricans came to Waukegan. Reasons that are larger than the individual decisions that we make, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of those. Our community, as I mentioned, is transnational, right? We cross borders, sometimes with permission and sometimes without permission, right? We, Puerto Ricans, come back and forth from the island, right? We live lives that are larger than the borders that define our community. And the last big point I want to say is that Latino, Latinx people are an important part of the future of Kane County and of the state of Illinois. And in fact, Kane County is very special in this way, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I want to show you an image here, and I was just talking with somebody before the talk here who was talking about the 1960s and that the Spanish-speaking community, the Latino community, was pretty small in the suburbs of Chicago, outside Chicago in the 1960s. By 2018, and this is even more true today, by 2022, this community just absolutely exploded. All Chicago suburbs in this period doubled in population. So more people left the city in the 1960s and 70s and 80s than ever before. The suburbs were booming in population. We sometimes refer to that as white flight, right? And we focus on Anglo residents that left the city. But when I looked more closely at the census data, I found that the fastest growing communities were always Latino communities, right? Puerto Rican communities in Waukegan, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in Elgin and Aurora. So the suburbanization of Chicago, this movement out of the city and the growth of communities like Elgin was in large part fueled by Latinos. Okay? The fastest growing communities were many of these communities. And today, and I repeat this fact a lot, but today there are more Latino people living in the suburbs of Chicago than live in the city. Okay? So I'm going to say that again because I think it's important. The bulk, the majority of the Latino population in Chicagoland lives outside of the city in communities like Elgin. And in fact, that's becoming more and more true as time goes on. Okay? Some of the largest growth in population in the last 2 decades has been among Latino people in communities like the ones that we're in right now. So that's the recent history, but over time, there have been waves of migration to these communities, and I want to just kind of go through them. I'll show you a few pictures as well pretty quickly here. But the first Mexicans that came in large numbers to the United States, and also that came to this region, were folks who were fleeing during the period of the Mexican Revolution, right? A little over 100 years ago. Some communities formed, small communities, right? In the Elgin area, in Aurora, and I'll talk about one in particular. But in general, the population diminished again in the 1930s. And that was in part because of an economic depression, but it was also because the federal government initiated a massive program to quote-unquote repatriate Mexican people. So to encourage them to go back to Mexico. Yeah, is that a question? Or yeah, go ahead.
What was the year or the years of the Mexican Revolution?
Around roughly 1910 to 1920 or 1921. Yeah. Long, bloody conflict, which very complicated, which led a lot of people to flee. Yeah, thank you for the question. But some scholars who have looked at the Mexican community in Aurora found that the communities really was diminished by this repatriation push. And not only people who were Mexican citizens were encouraged and forced to go back to Mexico, but American citizens of Mexican descent were as well. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Now the Latino community, as I understand it, really starts to get a foundation again in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I was very interested to find this, is that the folks who really started coming during this period were Puerto Ricans. Okay? The foundation, right, I believe, of this community in this period were Puerto Rican contract workers, okay, who were recruited to work in homes in Elgin, and who were recruited to work in foundries in Waukegan, and other similar types of jobs. So for much of this period, Puerto Ricans were a very important community, and up until around the 1970s, the Latino community in these places was about half Puerto Rican and about half Mexican, right? So I'll actually show you an interview with a gentleman who is one of the descendants of one of these first families. Starting in the 1970s and through the 1990s, the Mexican community all across the country, but in places like Elgin, Aurora, also Waukegan, just starts exploding. So I'm sure a lot of folks in the room here know people who migrated during this period, and Alma Nevares, who I was just telling the story about, migrated during this period as well. Just in dramatic numbers. Okay, I'll give you a few here. Since 1970, Kane County's overall population, everyone living in Kane County, that population has doubled. Okay, that's grown by 2 times. During that same period, the Latino population grew by 1,400%. That's 14 times as large. Okay. This is the period when Aurora and Elgin started to become nearly majority Latino. In Will County, where Joliet is, during this same period, the Latino community grew by 8 times. Okay. Today, Latinos make up 1 in 3 residents of Joliet. McHenry County had a very small Latino population in 1980, about 3,000 people. Today, that's 13 times as large. Okay? So we were talking about completely reshaping the demographics of these places. Lake County, 600%, 6 times as large. DuPage, 6.5 times as large. So these places were really exploding. After this kind of large boom, we know from the census data that the immigration plateaued a bit at the beginning of the first decade of the 21st century, and particularly after the economic disaster of 2007, 2008. immigration started to plateau. But other groups continued to come, other Spanish-speaking groups, folks from Central America, Guatemala, Venezuelans to Aurora, a diversity of groups, Hondurans to Waukegan as well. So now the community is diversified quite a bit. Okay. So I want to show you a couple images of a little bit of this history. Here is a picture of some of the early railroad camps in Eola, just outside of Aurora. The situation was similar in Elgin, that there were folks living in boxcars. I feel like there's a tight relationship between Mexican people and boxcars. I was even telling my students this week that my own grandfather, who was a bracero worker, he came to the United States in the 1940s. He rode in a boxcar. They spent days there, right? There were the residents of Eola even built a church out of leftover boxcar materials, right? There in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were lots of Latino workers, Mexican workers in particular, at Woodruff and Edwards. I found in 1965 an awards dinner photo, and there was an employee named Joe Garcia who received an award for 30 years of employment, right, at the foundry. So that means that he had started in 1935, so the middle of the Great Depression.
He's the third man on the left of the first row.
Is he right here?
Yeah,
Joe Garcia right there?
third, right? And my uncle's the one up in the corner.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you. So there's this very long history. We're talking about close to 100 years ago. It's just amazing to me. I do want to talk a little bit about the Puerto Rican context as well. And for folks who don't understand or you haven't been taught this history, because we are actually not normally taught this history in high school. But there has been a long relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. The relationship goes back before 1898, but 1898 was a very critical year in the history of Puerto Rico. That was the moment when the United States invaded Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War, and Puerto Rico became part of the United States. Puerto Rico is still part of the United States. I always ask my students, can Puerto Ricans vote for president? It's an important question, right? Do Puerto Ricans have a representative in Congress? They do, but that person cannot vote, right? Puerto Ricans living on the island cannot vote for president. They can vote in the presidential primaries, but if they move to the mainland, they can't vote for president. They have an incomplete citizenship, right? So the United States and Puerto Rico has had a very tight relationship. But I want to talk about how tight it's been and how that influenced the Puerto Rican migration to this part of the country. So I want to show you, based on what I have read and what the historians that I have read have determined, is that the first Puerto Ricans in Elgin were 3 women who worked in a contract, they worked in homes along Douglas Avenue, and they were bought as contract workers to be domestic servants, right? There were many, many men who were also brought to this region to work in foundries, particularly in Waukegan. And I want to, in the middle, I know you can't see that very well, but this is a report from the Department of Labor, so the U.S. Department of Labor, the federal government, in 1955, and it lists all of the important Puerto Rican communities across the country. And of course it lists New York, because New York has been the longest standing, most important Puerto Rican community outside of the island. But it also lists Elgin, Joliet, and Waukegan. So that's in 1955.
Chicago,
Right? Chicago as well, right? And looking at this, a lot of folks also have this misconception that Puerto Ricans migrated to Chicago and then, like most everybody else, decided to move to the suburbs. But what I found is that these communities, they developed at the same time, right? The community was developing in Chicago, it was also developing in Elgin, it was also developing in Waukegan. And they developed in different ways. But these men who were recruited to work in foundries like Chicago Hardware in Waukegan were recruited essentially to kind of undermine the local union movement. There had been a lot of union activity in Waukegan. There were even bloody fights in the late 1930s over the workers occupied a building and they were throwing rocks at the police and the police were shooting back. It got tumultuous. So the owner of Chicago Hardware said, you know, I think that maybe we should get workers from somewhere else. They went and set up an office in San Juan and recruited Puerto Rican workers and brought them to the United States. And one of those workers was the father of this gentleman right here, Tony Figueroa, and he is a person who we actually interviewed for our project, and he talks a little bit about his parents' transnational life, but also coming to Waukegan at this time. So let me see if I can get this up. Here's a short, about 5-minute clip or so of Mr. Figueroa.
Can you tell me a little bit about your family's migration from Puerto Rico to Waukegan in the 1940s?
Okay.
How and why did they end up in Waukegan?
Well, I was, my father's from Ciales, which is up in the mountains of Puerto Rico. And about 1947, under Operation Bootstrap, U.S. industry was really kicking into high gear after the Second World War. And they were recruiting Puerto Ricans to work in industry because Puerto Ricans were citizens. And it was easy to bring them, and we had Social Securities and numbers and everything, so it was easy recruiting them to work in. My father was recruited to work in a hardware foundry, North Chicago Hardware Foundry in North Chicago, and that's the influx of a lot of Puerto Ricans into Waukegan. They started working in the foundry, but from there they just broke off and started working in all the different industries in Waukegan. John's Manville was a big one. So that was just the influx, huge influx, mainly from Ciales, Puerto Rico, and Arecibo, which is an adjoining town in Puerto Rico. So most of the people that were in Waukegan in the early years were from Arecibo and Ciales, Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you. I am interested to hear about your dad's experiences in the foundry, but before we talk about that, can you tell me a little bit about Arecibo and Ciales? What did your parents talk about when they talked about Puerto Rico?
Oh, okay.
Tell me what you know about those places in Puerto Rico.
My dad and my mom were country people. My dad had a second grade education. My mom only had a third grade education. And if you know, we had to work. They had to work at a very early age. My mom was a domestic worker, and my dad did not like working in agriculture in Puerto Rico, because that was the big thing. Cutting sugarcane, agriculture was the big thing in Puerto Rico. And he did not like, so he migrated to the United States, and Waukegan was the big draw. There were other draws throughout the United States, but Waukegan was a big draw. Puerto Rico was mainly agricultural, like I said, and not a lot of jobs in Puerto Rico. Mainstays in Puerto Rico was a lot of, everybody had their community farm, where in the backyards they grew the plantains and the yames and malangas, and you could say it was all agricultural. And you know, when it was time to eat, they they killed chicken and made some stewed the chicken. And in fact, when I was 10 years old, I went back to Puerto Rico to visit my grandmother, and it was funny. The story was I was playing with this chicken when it came time for dinner. My grandmother grabbed the chicken and killed it, slammed it, broke its neck, slammed it. And I sit there just crying. I can remember that like it was yesterday. But you know, it's a lot of folklore growing up in Puerto Rico. It was Christmas time was really, really beautiful. I remember going there as a young man. Christmas was just really traditional. The music, my grandfather used to cut sugar cane. He would tell me he played with, he cut sugar cane with a guy named El Ramito, which is a folk singer and befriended him. And he would tell me the stories about cutting sugar cane, and they were all singing these folkloric songs. So sugar cane was, of course, the big industry in Puerto Rico.
Your grandfather sounds like a character. And you mentioned to me that he lived through some big moments in Puerto Rican history and American history. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your grandfather's like?
My fraternal grandfather.
Oh, okay.
My maternal grandfather was a World War I veteran, and he would tell me stories about because he was there when during the Spanish-American War. He was a young man, and when the Americans landed in Puerto Rico. But he would tell me stories about growing up in early in the 1900s. After he came back, not a lot of opportunities, just agriculture. But he never left Puerto Rico.
So that's a clip of a longer interview we did with Mr. Figueroa. He talks a little bit about growing up in particular neighborhoods. Most Puerto Ricans actually migrated to mostly black neighborhoods in Waukegan, and I found some of those similar dynamics in other communities where the communities that actually welcomed or where Latino people and new migrants were permitted tended to be the places where African Americans lived as well. So he talks a lot about that and hearing stories about the Black South growing up. But fast forward to the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, and today, Mexicans form the overwhelming majority of the Latino community in the United States, in Illinois, in Chicagoland, in Elgin, in Aurora, in Waukegan even as well, which had that historic Puerto Rican community. And one moment that I like to talk about as well, because it is such a significant moment during this period, is the 1986 IRCA law, the Immigration Reform and Control Act that was signed by Ronald Reagan. The real champion of that law was a Republican. It's this guy right here, 6'7" cowboy from Wyoming named Alan Simpson. He was a Republican. He was a conservative, right? Not normally the folks that you think of when you think about immigration reform, but he was a champion of this law. And in part, he was a champion because he had had direct experience as a lawyer in Wyoming witnessing the abuse that Mexican workers had suffered at the hands of their employers, right? He even tells a story about how one guy came in, he had been ripped off by his boss, and his boss happened to be the head of the Chamber of Commerce. And nobody would help this guy, right? Here he was, a poor Mexican man who didn't speak English well. He had been ripped off by one of the big guys in town, and all the lawyers were scared to touch the case, and Simpson was a tough guy. He knew, he had a very clear understanding of the difference between right and wrong, so he took the case, right? So through those experiences, he championed the cause of immigrants. It took him many years, but he moved the bill through. And Ronald Reagan eventually signed it, in part because the Iran-Contra scandal had just started heating up around this time, and Reagan needed a win. But part of the reason that, for whatever the reasons, this was an incredibly momentous moment in the history of Mexican people in the United States. We were just talking about this in my class today, that this is the last major immigration reform, right? And we're coming up on the 40-year anniversary of it. So we've been living under a system that has not been working well, essentially since 1986, and we see all the differences from that. But I'm sure I have family members who were affected by this law. I'm sure most folks in this room do as well. And I even say, I just kind of looked up these numbers and showed it recently at ECC. I even think at ECC that our student population was affected by this law as well. So on the left-hand side of this chart, that's 1957. That's just a little bit after ECC was founded. There were no Latino students. This chart charts the number of Latino students. The numbers started to rise in the 1970s as the population got bigger, but still relatively small. And then all of a sudden, it jumps, right? And that's after the 1986 immigration reform, when some of these people and some of their children, right, were able to come out of the shadows and start to participate fully in society. So folks were able to buy homes and start businesses that were approved by the city, do all kinds of things, contribute to the community. And this really reshaped our student body and reshaped the community. And I just learned last Friday that the student population at ECC is now 48% Latino. So almost very close, almost 1 in 2 of our students are Latino students. So we are already a Hispanic serving institution officially, but we're serving a lot of Hispanics at ECC, and I think we should really be proud of that as well. So all of this goes to show that the 1980s and the 1990s were really a Mexican boom, right, in this community and around the country. You can see here that the population of Latino people in Aurora, Chicago Heights, Elgin, Joliet, Waukegan, Chicagolandia as a whole is just skyrocketing, which really ends up reshaping the demographics and the community in general. And I think I said that I wanted to leave some time for questions. So I want to end with this last chart, and just to kind of re-emphasize this point. This is a chart from our friends at the Latino Policy Forum. They've been doing wonderful work for a very long time. And there's a lot of information here, but the chart really shows the census data for 2010, which are the light yellow bars, and the census data for 2020. And this is the percentage of Latino people living in different parts of the state. Okay? Now I want you to take a good look at this and note which place has the longest bars, right? Which is the most Latino place in the entire state. It's not Chicago, it's not Cook County, right? It's Kane County. So that means that between 2000 and 2010, Kane County was the most Latino county in all of Chicagoland, right? And between 2010 and 2020, that became even more so, right? Today, 1 in 3 residents of Kane County is Hispanic or Latino. That means that we have a very special responsibility, I think, here in Kane County to celebrate this community, to serve this community, and really accept the fact that Latinos have really remade this community and this region. And I think that we have some work to do in that area, but I think talking about it and recognizing it is one place to start. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I do want to save some time for any questions or discussion. Does anybody have any questions or comments at all about anything that you've heard so far? Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking about the reshape of the Chicagoland area, how numbers have increased dramatically. Can you speak a little bit on how we have impacted the political atmosphere, and as well as elected officials and non-elected, and how we've politically evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And the Latino Policy Forum, in fact, they are the best voice on this, right, on political action. I was looking at some archives from the 1980s and the 1990s. Oh, here's a question. Yeah, do you want me to repeat it? I can repeat the question. Sure. Okay, yep, sorry about that. So the question was, if I'm going to paraphrase it, well, let me let her get back. She's the interpreter. Around, I was talking about how the community was affected by new Latinos. How has that played out in the political realm? Is what I think your question was. So Latino Policy Forum is a really good resource for this. They put out constant press releases. They're big advocates for more Latino political participation. But I was looking at the archives, archival newspaper stories from the 1980s, and I noticed that Latinos in places like Elgin and Waukegan were getting together and saying, we need more representation. Then I started looking at articles from, I remember, 1994, where a group of Latinos got together in front of the Elgin City Council and said, we need more political representation. And I don't know if you've looked at the City Council in Elgin recently, but I think it continues to be true that we need more political representation. At our own ECC, which again, 1 in 2 students are Latino, we just have our first Latino board member in a long time, and he was not elected, he was appointed. So he's one of 7 people. And we're very happy to have him, and we're very happy to have all the board members, but I think you bring up an important point.
How were they appointed?
So he was appointed because one of the board members stepped down to take a different position. So then there was a vacancy, and he was appointed by the board. Yeah. So I actually have written a PhD on this subject on the Latino communities in Greater Chicago, and it kind of traces from the 1940s to the present. And what I think is that the institutions have, all of this demographic change has happened over the last 40 years, and the institutions have lagged. They have not responded, right? And I think that nothing made that clearer than the COVID pandemic, right? I think it became very, very clear that our institutions in this region have very little connection to the community. In many cases, they weren't translating things into Spanish. They didn't know the important churches, the important leaders. So when information needed to get out, it didn't. And one thing that I talked about quite a bit during the pandemic is the way resources were allocated. Vaccines and other resources were not concentrated in the places that were hardest hit during the pandemic. Frankly, they were concentrated in the wealthiest communities in Kane that needed it the least, right? So I think in some ways the resources are lagging, and in other ways folks have not stepped up. So I think that, I teach political science as well. I think that's a really, really important question. So thank you for asking it.
Can I ask a follow-up then?
Oh, absolutely.
So what is, in your expert opinion, being a political scientist, how can we engage the community to get more politically active and to encourage people to run for these positions that have so much more impact on us?
That's a really good question. I think, it's about organizing. It's about getting people together and being somebody who's, kind of observed this community and participated in different ways. I see, it's almost like there's at least 2 communities, right? There's kind of the power brokers, and some of them are Latino, but there is a very vibrant and intelligent and creative Latino community made up of everyday people, right, that care about important issues. They care about the future of their kids. They care about education. They care about what's happening in the school district and what's happening, on all types of issues. And I think it's really about getting together and educating each other and being aware, right? Showing up at meetings of the school board, of the city council, the board of trustees. I would love it if there were more parents showing up at the ECC board of trustees meeting, because I know people have opinions. We want to hear them. For me, it's always about, and I used to be a community organizer before I worked at ECC, so I'm big on organization, and I think the history tells us that organizing gets the goods, right? Is even if people are poor, even if they are don't speak the majority language, if you get together and you can make your voice heard. So that's my personal opinion. Yeah.
I want to point out something about the census from the 40s.
Okay. Yeah.
It says that the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans were about equal, but that's not true. The Puerto Ricans could vote and could be counted in the census.
Yeah.
The Mexicans could not.
Right.
So they didn't count not even half of the Mexicans that were here.
Yeah.
So they were not equal.
Okay.
And my mother's family was one of the first Mexican families to come here, 1921. They had five families, six families that first came. The railroads brought the Mexicans. They just didn't come on their own. The railroads went to Mexico, contracted with people, promised them homes and all food, and that they would be able to come. They would get their citizenship papers, and we made a lot of promises that they didn't keep. And the people ended up living in those boxcars that you saw, and that's not what they had promised them. Elgin didn't let, the grocery stores wouldn't let the Mexicans buy groceries. Only one in downtown Elgin, Ballman Grocery Store, was the only one that let the Mexicans buy groceries.
What year?
1926, 1928. They had so many things that were not pointed out. My aunt, my mother's oldest sister, they came because my aunt had been kidnapped by a bunch of soldiers. And my uncles had to go looking for her from camp to camp. And when they found her, they had to trade something for her. My mother's family worked on the farm and lived on the ranch for Fox family, the one that eventually became president. So the mother, she helped my grandma get something together so that they could trade it, food and horses and things like that, so they could trade them for my aunt to get her back.
Wow.
So that's mainly part of the story of why my family came, my mother's family came in 1926.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for sharing about the inaccuracies of the census. The census is not the best measure, right? And even after the 1970 census, the 1980 census, the 2020 census, right? Latino people in particular have spoken up and said, look, like, we're not getting counted in the way, even though, when we see these numbers, it's pretty clear that there was even an undercount in 2020 as well. So thank you so much. This is why I want you to be in come to my class, is all these stories. It's really wonderful.
I've been fortunate. I was able to interview a lot of people. One lady, she was 92 years old, and I interviewed her, and she said, I don't care if you don't put anything in your book about what I've told you. She said, but you have to put that I was the best on the coffee bars at school, and I won all the clean teeth contests. She was happy that they let her go to school.
Yeah.
And this was 1927.
Right. Yeah, so in that way, things have changed, right? I think it's interesting for me to hear, about all the promises that were made to workers to come and work on the railroads. When I look at the news this week, and the Florida governor was making promises to Venezuelan migrants to get on a plane and go somewhere as well. I think that's a theme throughout Latino history, is that you know, and they'll do kind of whatever they can to get us to work. And then when we're done working, in some cases they want folks to go back, you know. This kind of cycle, I feel like it's a big theme. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. Any other comments or questions at all? Yeah, go ahead.
In your research, did you see anything on like the economic impact of Latinos in the Chicagoland area? So right, the latest research I saw is that our Latino economic impact is at $100.1 billion in the state of Illinois GDP, right? That's larger than the whole state of Hawaii. So do you have anything on like just the Chicagoland area and this area of how the like Latino economic impact?
I don't. That was not part of what I researched. Though, one of the things when I started looking at the 1990s that I did realize was just the dramatic impact and the dramatic demand for Latino labor in industries across the suburbs. And a lot of that in the 1990s, and particularly after September 11, came through temp agencies. So one of the connections here is that I heard the gentleman who was in charge of census outreach for the state of Illinois. They wanted to get Latinos counted, right? Because they knew that there was probably going to be an undercount. And he actually used the data from the temp agencies to find Latino people because he knew that there was such extensive data on temp agencies. So Kane County, the last numbers that I've seen, is the second most dense, has the second highest density of any county in the United States in terms of temp agencies. And most of those temp workers are Latino. In fact, so many are Latino that there have been even multiple lawsuits about the fact that Latino workers are preferred over African American workers and over other kinds of workers. So this, one of the things that I did come to the determination that, you know, the reason this boom happened in the 80s and 90s was it was work, it was labor. And those workers came in such large numbers that they propped up these growing suburbs in a really, really important way. One of the big centers of economic activity in the greater Chicago area is the Elk Grove Village suburban industrial park, and it's right next to O'Hare, right? That is the largest industrial park in the, I don't know if it's in North America or the world. Let's say North America, let's be conservative about that. That's the largest industrial park in North America. Most of those companies are staffed by Latino workers, and most of those Latino workers are staffed through temp agencies.
Now, which area did you say?
So Elk Grove Village,
Oh, okay.
there's this massive industrial park there.
You're saying that's the largest in the country?
It's the largest in North America.
Okay.
It's just sprawling. And many of those factories are staffed by Latino workers. So the fact that, I mean, I believe that Latino labor has really, we talked about the growth of the suburbs and, you know, how all of the economic, a lot of the economic, you know, centers have moved to the suburbs in the 80s and 90s. I think a lot of that was made possible by Mexican immigrants and folks who were working really hard. So that's my opinion after spending many years studying this. Yeah. So thank you, that's a wonderful question. Yes, ma'am?
Just to connect those dots, I've worked in education policy and I'm currently working on national public policy. And it almost seems like that connection of the $1 billion needs to be made to the universities and the political leaders that, well, now we've built your state, so we need engines of leadership development at UIC, and UIC is doing a lot of stuff, but just like ECC is starting to develop more around this consciousness, it's like, where's our Center for Political Leadership at ECC that's gonna have the Aurora, you know, political leadership and all these surrounding areas. So just to connect those, I think we have to put the dollars to the demands, and I know that's how, I know Sylvia Puente
You mean like,
Institute, she thinks that way, you know, but I think we need to do that in the suburbs.
Yeah.
we to do what with the money? To pressure politicians?
Yes, to pressure and higher education institutions that actually develop institutes to train people to run for office.
Okay.
That's kind of how it works in other places.
I like how you think, because actually a colleague and I are working on developing like a civic engagement center at ECC, and I think we have a very diverse student population. You know, most folks grew up in District 509 that serves Elgin in the area, and you know, we hope to do. and part of the reason we came to that is because I have seen so many really remarkable leaders come through my classrooms. I even tell one of the stories in my dissertation of a young woman who, she was born here in Elgin, but her mother was undocumented, and her mother was not able to stay in the United States because of the family situation, and they returned to Guanajuato, and she brought her daughter. And her daughter, went to school for a while, but they didn't quite have the money for transportation to high school, so she started working in a shoe factory in Guanajuato. And she decided, I'm an American citizen, I don't want to leave my mom, but I'm going to come back to Elgin and finish my high school. She came back, she went to Larkin High School, she graduated at age 17. She ended up in one of my political science courses at age 17. We went to Springfield to a model Illinois government simulation, and I'll never forget that she got a standing ovation from about 200 students from across the state for a speech she made. She came back, she got elected the president of student government at ECC, then she became a student trustee, then she joined a statewide Illinois Community College board. I don't even know if she was 20 by that time. I mean, she was very young, right? And here's somebody without her mother, right? Making it. And I think those are the type of people
There's
that
tons
we
of
need.
leaders like that. Yeah.
And absolutely.
That's our community.
There's plenty of people that way, and they need some access to make a change. I totally agree with what folks are saying. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to point out that Dr. Sam has been very influential in getting more Hispanics to ACC and graduating and being recognized. I think he's done a fabulous job.
Yeah, I feel very blessed to have him, and I think his own story is very remarkable. He's for folks who don't know, the president of our college for the last 16 years is Ghanaian. So he grew up in West Africa, and he's got like 2 PhDs and a theology degree. I think he might even have a law degree. Like he wants to do more. He's about this tall, little fireball. He's very committed to a diverse student population. We're lucky to have him. Yeah, thank you for adding that. Was there another question or
Yeah,
comment?
did you say that you had written a dissertation on a particular topic? Wondering which topic or topics, and could I read that for free on the internet?
It's not available on the internet yet, so because I'm hoping to write a book sometime. I'm pretty busy now, but with little kids and teaching and everything. But it's not available. If you sent me an email, I'd be happy to share it with you. That'd be fine. But it is on the history of Latinos from about the 1940s to the present in Waukegan, Aurora. I look at Prince Crossing Farm in West Chicago, and then a little bit of Elgin as well. So, but the kind of gist of it is what I'm talking about here is that Latino suburbs or greater Chicago communities are just a really important part of the Latino story in the Midwest and in Chicagoland and across the country. So, yeah, I'd be happy to share it. We're almost out of time. Any final thoughts? Yeah.
How many minutes are left?
We're about 4 minutes over time, but I'm not going anywhere if anybody has another comment or question.
Okay, great. I'm curious, what was El Conquistador? There was a picture of a publication. What is that?
Yes, so I know some folks know the person who published Conquistador. So that was a newspaper that was published out of Aurora.
Started in Elgin.
Started in Elgin.
And the owner lived in Elgin.
I hear she's even back. I hear this is a rumor.
No,
But
it's a fact. I had lunch with her the other day.
there you go. Okay. So I'm hoping to interview her as well. Conquistador is fascinating, and there actually are copies of every single issue in a downstate library. So I had them requested here, and I spent probably a week reading every article. You get just a really important picture of what was happening in these communities in the 90s. So and I don't know Laura, but she sounds like a pretty remarkable individual. So so that's one of the papers I was on. Yeah. Any other comments or
In your opinion, would it be preferable for Puerto Rico to remain a part of the U.S. or for it to do its own thing, or to have a kind of sort of maybe situation?
I think I'll leave that to the Puerto Rican people. They've been arguing over this for 124 years, and folks have very strong opinions on all sides of this. You know, statehood, Commonwealth, independence. But
If they
yeah.
want to buy themselves, who would be helping them now with what's going on?
It's a sad, it's a very sad situation, and it has been. Yeah, right. So I think that's up to the Puerto Rican people, and I hope that they are able to decide that for themselves. Yeah.
What would you say might be the heritage or the lineage of like the majority of white-skinned Mexicans?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, Mexican people are a mixture of European descended people, indigenous people, and African people.
I think there was German revolutionaries that came down during the 1848 revolutions, and perhaps went to Texas and then came down to Texas. There's also from Irish from the St. Patrick's Battalion, right? Who helped the Mexicans during that. And then
There's
also
French. Yeah.
there were some French people as well.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about like, is there like an official thing here?
I think it depends on what period you're talking about and what region.
Okay.
I think we'll have time for one more because yeah, go ahead.
Okay, between Latin and Latinx and Hispanic and Spanish speaker, why not just say Latin as an academic person?
Yeah.
What is your actual preference?
I think we have another hour. Or no? We have talked about this a lot at ECC because we call our month Latinx Heritage Month. It was Hispanic Heritage Month for many years. Students asked for it to be changed to Latino, and then students asked for it to be changed to Latinx. Now I've had students tell me, Professor Ramirez, you can't say Latinx, you have to say Latinx, because Latinx is, you can't pronounce it in Spanish, right? And so Argentinian folks and South American folks have started saying Latinx, which kind of like rolls up the tongue a little bit better, and it's gender neutral. My personal opinion is that I think the whole thing is fascinating. I think we should have more conversations about language. We should have more conversations about how labels define us or don't define us. I start off my class talking about how this idea of Latino, what does it even mean, right?
And Chicano, right? Remember that?
Right, Chicanos, right, yeah, absolutely. And that also was a reclamation of a term that was a slur. I mean, Chicano, right?
From where? Chicano was?
It was, yeah, in the Southwest, it was a way to disparage people, right? Chicano, it's almost like how young people have reclaimed this term queer, right?
That's a cool fact, yeah.
Yeah, as you know, when I was a kid and you called somebody that word, it was an insult, and now folks have reclaimed it. And so I think the more discussion, the better. I think it's good to have respectful discussions and to respect each other's opinions. But I think it's good that we're having this conversation in person. That's my own personal view. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. I know it's after the talk.